Good evening to everybody. I'm told we're going to start on time and presumably always end on time, so no presumably. So my name is Scott Helpstein. I am Director of Strategic Initiatives at West Point's Combating Terrorism Center and co-sponsor for tonight's event, which we have worked with Karen and her team to put together. It's a real pleasure to be here. I can't imagine a more timely, possibly timely night to pick to discuss this. I think in the last week, we've watched Bitcoin value go down 30 to 40%, and some of the major houses really under significant pressure, which begs the question, is this real? Is this not? Should we all be moving all of our money into Bitcoin, or is that perhaps a little premature? And I think we've got a really great panel today to talk about all the complicated facets, from the technology to the economics, to the public policy, to the national security. So just real quick, we'll start on the far end. We're really pleased to have Dr. David Wu, who is the head of global rates and currency research at Bank of America Merrill Lynch. He's been at this for quite some time, and he is one of the first Wall Street analysts to actually put out a published report on Bitcoin, and in fact tried to put a value on it. And so we look forward to hearing a little bit more about that. Next to him is Andy Greenberg, a staff writer for Forbes, and the author of The Machine Kills Secrets, Julian Assange, the Cypherpunks, and their fight to empower whistleblowers. And he's been covering this topic for some time as well. I'm a big fan of your work, sir. And then finally, Chip Poncy, co-founder of the Financial Integrity Network. And he got there by being the inaugural director for strategic policy at the director of the Office of Strategic Policy for Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes. And then finally, leading our discussion tonight will be Karen Greenberg, who really needs no introduction to this audience, since she is the director here for the Center for National Security.
Well, welcome. As you know, this is a new topic for us here at the Center on National Security, but I think it's probably a new topic for you as well. So I have first thing I have to say is this event is off the record. So that means can't be taped, can't be broadcast, shouldn't be tweeted, and if you want to talk to any of the panelists afterwards for any of those reasons, that's up to you. But we prefer to respect recognition. And that's because of the fact that we have a rather distinguished panel who is talking about a very new topic and a very complicated legally as well as financially problem or issue. And we want to give them the freedom to think the thoughts they think without having to worry about being quoted and punished and made fun of and copied. So I'm just explaining that little policy that we have. So this is off the record, as have been some of our events in the past, and everybody's always respected that well. So think about Bitcoin. Why is the Center on National Security doing Bitcoin? I think would be the question I'd like to be able to answer by the end of this session. Because it's not the most obvious national security issue, particularly for a center that focuses on terrorism. But we also focus on cybersecurity, and there's some ways in which the issues of terrorism, particularly financial counterterrorism, and the law and the cybersphere have all begun to collide in the issue of Bitcoin. And then there's that underlying issue that always comes up, which is, isn't the economy always a matter of national security? And certainly, this gives us, Bitcoin, gives us the opportunity to discuss many issues that really need discussion all at the same time. So in an hour and a half, you can get everything you ever need to know in all of those issues. I want to cover what happened this week in Bitcoin, but first, because I don't know exactly who's in the audience and what we know, I want to ask each one of you the same question, which is, what is Bitcoin? Is it a currency? Is it money? How do we distinguish it from money? What does it mean to have a, what is it called, crypto site or whatever?
Cryptocurrency.
Yeah, a cryptocurrency. What does it mean to have a virtual currency? And what actually is this? If somebody said to you, what is Bitcoin? Can you answer that? And I mean like in 2 sentences. So, no, seriously, because I want to get on to the discussion. Like, what, if it is something, it should be definable. And so, let's start with you, Andy, and you can tell us, and then we'll move on. So, go ahead.
Well, Bitcoin is a decentralized cryptocurrency, decentralized digital currency that basically uses cryptography rather than regulation to prevent forgery or fraud. Its cryptographic properties make it impossible to forge a Bitcoin or to spend one twice. If you spend it, it's gone, like real money. But that's not, so that's enforced through code, through crypto, rather than through the police or the Secret Service tracking counterfeit bills or whatever. But my main interest in Bitcoin as a reporter who covers cybersecurity and hackers, and I wrote a book about WikiLeaks, and I'm really interested in online anonymity, is that it's a potentially pseudonymous currency. It's not anonymous, but a Bitcoin is only attached to an address rather than a name. So you can have basically a kind of digital bank account on your computer, but it's not connected to any bank or no government can tie your identity to it, essentially. So Bitcoin is not anonymous by default, but it can be pseudonymous. And that is what, for me, opens up all these interesting new potentials of it, that it can be used as a kind of untraceable pseudo-anonymous currency.
David, what is it from the perspective of somebody who deals in the financial industry? What is Bitcoin?
Right. I think, there are many aspects of Bitcoin, but I think the most fundamental, aspect of Bitcoin that is so, important to understanding why somebody wanted to basically invent it and why so many people have actually jumped on the bandwagon is exactly the word decentralized. And what does decentralized mean? Like, think about it, when you actually, right now, when you make let's say you get a check to your doctor, okay, right now, how does that check get cleared? Right? Let's just, you've got an account with Bank of America, and your doctor's got an account with Bank of America. Let's just say, not all Bank of America, but let's say with Citibank. Essentially, that check will have to get cleared, essentially through the Federal Reserve. Through basically the bank account of Bank of America, and Citibank holds with the Fed. So that's how it gets basically cleared. Meaning that when you're operating in the realm of ordinary, conventional currencies, you cannot live without the central bank. You cannot live without commercial banks. And Bitcoin does away with all that. So I would argue Bitcoin, from our point of view, is a reactionary, I think, evolution or revolution. In some sense, I think people were so upset about what happened in 2008 with the collapse of Lehman Brothers, with the Fed printing money, and so on and so forth. I think it's against that backdrop that this whole interest of trying to do without banks and central banks sort of came into being. And Bitcoin exactly does that. So you can actually make a payment, okay, in Bitcoin to anybody on the face of the earth without going through a central bank or basically a commercial bank. All you need to have a digital wallet where you've got a currency in it, and then you make a payment to somebody else who also has a digital wallet that will actually receive your payments. So therefore, once you understand that, okay, then the question is, how do you prove? This is the difficulty. This is why Bitcoin, whoever basically invented Bitcoin, should probably get a Nobel Prize. This guy's clearly a genius. Because you say, well, okay, fine. But you know what? How can you actually do without JP Morgan or Citibank or even Federal Reserve, right? Because the idea is that you have a bank account with Citibank. Citibank basically vouches that bank account belongs to you. They've got your social security number, as opposed to doing the due diligence. They want to make sure that you say you are who you are, and then that money is yours. But when you're basically operating in a digital world, like who's going to basically vouch for you? That money that you want to make a payment to basically actually says yours. That's where the cryptology basically comes into play. That's where the miners come into play. You've got these so-called miners who get paid for validating transactions, essentially, basically furnishing proof that, the money that you said that is yours actually is yours. And so from that point of view, that's where Bitcoin really starts to depart from the conventional payment system. But I think the most important thing to understand about Bitcoin is that, the reason why so many people perhaps have vested interest that Bitcoin does not become any more than it has is that it actually takes on the entire, basically traditional financial system, including all of the payment systems.
Chip, why don't you pitch in here and talk a little bit about the international arena and what Bitcoin means, not just in terms of the banking structure, but what it means in terms of thinking about the position of the United States in the world. And you have to speak first.
I usually don't need a mic, but thanks, Karen. I need to take Karen on the road to introduce me wherever I go, including my family. Any sort of erroneous attribution or misstatements. Love that intro, it's fantastic. Excuse me, as a middle child, I am more than happy to stick around and talk all day long about this issue, or about illicit finance broadly. I don't have a life. My life is what I've been doing wise for a long time, and I'm obsessed by it. I think it's fascinating people. So, very grateful to be here tonight, and certainly on call afterwards to follow up with any discussion or interest that folks may have. Thank you, Karen, Scott, for including me, and David for.
Can you speak up?
Yeah, I'm sorry. It turns out I do need a microphone. But thank you. So what is the perspective of the international community, or even the sort of Treasury financial policy community when it comes to Bitcoin? It's a great question. How would you define it? I agree with what Andy and David have said. I think that there is an element to Bitcoin that is about escaping the oversight or the entanglement of government, as well as commercial and central banks. I think that's fair. But I think another way to look at it is this is just the next step in the evolution of payment systems, where there is a constant market-driven effort to make more efficient, i.e. less costly and more effective payment systems. And there are margins on how payment systems work now that Bitcoin is challenging, and that there is legitimate economic interest and demand behind that. I also think that there are those that see Bitcoin, picking up on Andy's theme, as a way to escape or evade detection, not because of a lack of confidence necessarily in the government, but because they don't want to be seen by authorities that are in charge of policing or enforcing the laws on the books when it comes to combating illicit finance. That's a different class of users that has been more or less in the news of late in defining the space, and I think it's Silk Road in particular. But becoming a currency of choice for people who are interested in buying or paying for illicit goods. So that's sort of where I come at it, and what that means is there is an interesting opportunity associated with Bitcoin as the current manifestation of evolution of payment systems. And there is real vulnerability associated with that by bad actors, whether it's Bitcoin today or stored value cards yesterday or cash perennially. They're just seeking ways to finance, pay for, transact in ways that allow them to do nefarious things. And Bitcoin is the latest manifestation of that.
Okay, so Andy used the term pseudonymous, okay. And the term usually associated with Bitcoin is anonymous. And so I guess I don't really understand what the value from a legal point of view is to having, what is the value of anonymous exchange, money exchange, if you're not a criminal?
Well, there are lots of reasons to distrust the government or to want to evade. There's civil disobedience, WikiLeaks. In some ways, Bitcoin became interesting to me when WikiLeaks started to accept it as a means of donation after Visa, MasterCard, and PayPal, and Bank of America, and everybody else cut off payment to the website. And that seemed to me to be a really awful kind of extra-legal way to stifle free speech. The fact that WikiLeaks could still accept Bitcoin was, in fact, an interesting way for people to anonymously contribute to this, potentially very valid cause when they didn't have any other way to do it. And there are things that people want to do privately that are not illegal. In fact, it seems like it may be the case already, that Bitcoin's, killer app is the porn industry. There's already half a dozen of the biggest porn sites that accept Bitcoin because people don't want this on their credit card statement for obvious reasons. So privacy is important. It's not always, you don't always have something legal to hide just because you want to be private.
Well, one of the things that people, and this has been a week where the press has just been full of your articles and other articles on Bitcoin. So, David, one of the things they've asked for is a Bitcoin bank, a cryptocurrency bank. Is this a possibility with anonymity?
Kind of doesn't make any sense to me because, like, as I said before, Bitcoin's supposed to do, basically do away with banks. So why would you want to basically want to bring back a bank? I mean, so I think that doesn't make any sense to me. If it's okay with you, I'd like to basically address, some of this question. I think, because I think the anonymity aspect of Bitcoin and the international perspective, that's where the cyber is from. Because in some sense, you could argue that the rest of the world got into Bitcoin even before the Americans did, right? Because if you think about, when Bitcoin started to take off, in 2012 and then in 2013, you ask yourself, what's the backdrop? And because most of you only started hearing about Bitcoin late 2013, when it was already, a pretty established, I think, phenomenon, in the Far East, even in Europe. In 2000, in some sense, it's understandable why Bitcoin took root out of the United States. Because in many other countries, especially where, you've got capital controls, you've got the fear of deposit confiscation and so on and so forth, people saw Bitcoin as a tremendous, essentially way to get away from the government. Good example is Cyprus, right? So you've all heard about the European crisis in 2011 and 12. So at one point, basically, they were literally threatening to essentially, in order to pay their debt, they were going to basically confiscate 20% of all deposits. Okay, so the idea was that you're going to wake up in the morning, you're going to go to your bank account, and your account is going to be 20% less than yesterday. And you can imagine that in that kind of atmosphere, everybody was trying to get their money out of the euro, and that's when Bitcoin price really started to appreciate, actually very substantially. In fact, the first university in the world to accept Bitcoin for tuition is the National University of Cyprus. And it's actually a fact that actually is going to go down in history if Bitcoin is still with us in 100 years' time. Another basically place where Bitcoin is now growing very rapidly is Argentina. But Argentina, you probably, I don't know if you follow the press of Argentina, they had a little bit of a meltdown last week. Essentially, I'm just put it politely, please don't put me on that. But clearly, they've been running irresponsible monetary policy, fiscal policy. There's been exodus and outflows, capital outflows from the country, so they were running out of reserves. They had to allow the currency to depreciate. Guess what? In that kind of environment, in which a person can, in Argentina wants to basically buy a dollar, he has to basically buy it in the black market. And then the black market, the Argentine peso is worth much less than actually the official market. So from that point, against that backdrop, Bitcoin is taking off. In China, Bitcoin was a huge thing until very recently because precisely China also has capital controls. It's not like, you want to basically take your money out of China, you can do so. But guess what? If you've got Bitcoin, you can pay for, prices, you can pay for apartments in Manhattan actually just as easily as you can basically pay for your groceries with your RMB basically around the corner. So I think from that point of view, I think you need to understand why Bitcoin sort of became big outside the United States, and because a lot of countries that have problems where there's genuine distrust of the government, that has been the hotbed for Bitcoin. But now we're going to come back eventually, but I think the real future of Bitcoin is actually here, because actually. But we're going to come back and talk about other things.
Chip, what about the Treasury, as in the U.S. Treasury? How do they see Bitcoin? I saw that Larry Summer talked about regulating it, regularizing it, and making an institutional home for it. Really? How does this figure into, why wouldn't the U.S. Treasury just say, that's not U.S. currency, we have a U.S. currency, that's illegal? Why wouldn't they say that?
Fair question. So I should start by saying I don't work for the Treasury Department anymore. So the ethics folks would kill me if that were in any way implied by my remarks. So I'm a free agent at this point. But having spent a lot of time at the Treasury Department during a formative period, the policy associated with combating illicit finance, and that's the perspective I have. I also was able to work across the building from other perspectives that are really relevant to this issue. So when you ask, how does the Treasury Department respond? I immediately, my brain works in the lanes of the Treasury Department to say, well, we know that from the TFI perspective, which is the counter illicit finance perspective, they're going to look at Bitcoin as just another mechanism through which bad guys can either launder money or finance illicit activity, which doesn't make it inherently good or bad, it just makes it another vehicle. And the way that we deal with these vehicles is to regulate them to ensure that the providers, the exchangers, and the parties that are involved in the processing of Bitcoins or any other currency or payment system, understand and implement a series of obligations that ideally prevent arbitrage for regulatory compliance purposes across various options that the market can hold. Whether you want to settle in dollars or Bitcoins, or you want to pay in goods rather than currency. If you were transferring value, then you were subjected to a certain set of requirements that allows the government to understand who is entering the system, who's exiting the system, and who's conducting suspicious activity to be illicit. Bitcoin is just another player from that perspective, but it has a whole bunch of unique attributes to it that make that mission a little bit more challenging, and we can talk about that later. Another perspective that will come to the fore, and this is maybe less visible, is the critical infrastructure and protection of the United States. And to the extent that this whole sort of space of cyber, in my view, it's evolved to a point of integrating two very different communities. You had a cyber community that was focused on, at least from a Treasury perspective, critical infrastructure protection, things like DDoS attacks and these people online that were taking down different parts of our critical infrastructure, or at least attacking it in ways that were increasingly disturbing. And there's a whole sort of community of interests and authorities that are responsible for responding to those sorts of threats. And that's traditionally been thought of as cyber, and cyber security and cyber threats, and whether you're securing your information or your operations online and with IT, that's sort of in that cyber universe. As opposed to the cyber threats that, to me, Bitcoin really is more of a manifestation of. And that's just the use of the internet to perpetrate illicit finance. And that's a different lane. So the Treasury Department would have two different responses, and that's starting to converge in, I think, a healthy way. The third lane is maybe the most immediately apparent. That's the legitimate economic interest lane, where the Treasury Department has, I think, rightly, historically looked at any innovation in the payment system not as inherently bad, but as interesting. And there's always an environment in which innovation creates some uncertainty, both with business models and technology associated with performance and with regulation that will inevitably be required to make sure that that technology is folded into the pre-existing environment in a way that is fair, consistent, and creates a level playing field. That period of uncertainty is always just that. It's uncertain. You go back and ask the card people what it was like to try to develop stored value card models 10, 15 years ago, or people who were doing the phones and the mobile banking just is still doing it. And now the internet-based payment systems, settlement systems, including cryptocurrencies. And this is just, again, an example of innovation where the Treasury Department wants to encourage innovation to maximize efficiency in the financial system. At the same time, doesn't want to create arbitrage or anonymity that defeats our policy purposes. That's how the Treasury Department's going to look at it. And through that lens, you'll see the Treasury has started to make statements and take action, particularly in combating illicit finance. We have guidance now that's been issued from FinCEN. You've got enforcement actions, not only from the Justice Department and Silk Road, but from the Treasury Department and the Foreign Reserve last year. And you have interpretive guidance that FinCEN issued just, I think, last month on Bitcoin, as to what's a user, what's an exchanger, what's an administrator, who's regulated, under what rules. So you're starting to see now that the regulatory environment is beginning to get colored in. That's a natural process at Treasury. That if you're a Bitcoin watcher or sort of a technology person, you wouldn't be privy to that. But that's just that's pretty consistent for how Treasury views these sorts of developments.
Well, then how do we assess the fact that other countries are making the use of Bitcoins illegal? How does that fit into the
Yeah, that is interesting, isn't it? So there was a recognition.
And let's talk about which countries.
Sure. So Russia and China have been in the press, right? And that's a pretty big market.
Are there others?
And pretty big political influence. There's a lot of conversations, I understand it, but there has not been any outright prohibition that I'm aware of that's visible the way China and Russia have been. What I find interesting about that is, and I have it over there, I was going to wave it as sort of this impressive exhibit. It really is impressive. But you have historically a recognition from all financial centers taking politics and suspending them as much as we can to come up with rules of the road to govern the financial system in a way that creates opportunity for criminal investigators, for national and global security interests to track, trace, finance, and take disruptive action against actors of concern. That sort of mission, which is the TFI mission in USG, is a global one, and it's grounded in a global commitment to combating financial crime. And as much as our own Congress can't agree on what color the sky is, much less the P5 agree on what's a conflict and what's a freedom fighting expression versus terrorism, you have nonetheless all the financial centers around the world that have now for over 2 decades been able to agree fundamentally on progressive policy over how you govern the financial system for purposes of combating financial crime. And in that environment, Russia and China are big players. And that organization, the Financial Action Task Force, has issued just last year guidance on new payment methods that includes internet-based payment systems. Now, it sort of predated all of this attention, at least in the United States, to Bitcoin. But those conversations on virtual currencies have been happening in that organization as well. And they've been constructed in the way that you would hope they would be. Pointing to, for example, the hearings here in New York and obviously on the Hill, where it wasn't a presumption that this is bad and explain why we should criminalize. It was more of a, what is this? How do we treat this? Much more of an open mind. And that has characterized the policy discussions, but it's not consistent with what we see from individual players. My guess is that over time you will see, as sort of the panic and the uncertainty and the ignorance is replaced by more deliberative thought, a coherence and an integration policy in order to make this work in a global financial system.
Andy, what happened this week?
Oh, wow. Where to begin?
Do it right now, because then I'm going to ask David to explain it.
Yeah.
So.
I think David, yeah, we'll leave it. What happened this week is really like I guess the final crisis that's sort of been slowly unfolding for weeks now, which is that Mt. Gox, which used to stand for Magic the Gathering Online Exchange, and then they decided to pivot into becoming the biggest Bitcoin exchange platform. And for a while, 2011 was the only real way to buy and sell Bitcoins for dollars or yen or euros or whatever. They've had some kind of crisis that's prevented them from allowing anyone to withdraw the Bitcoins that they bought, which has, of course, been a huge scandal. So I guess it was maybe last week or the week before that they blamed this problem that they've frozen Bitcoin withdrawals on a bug they said in Bitcoin called transaction malleability, which just it's too complicated for even me to want to wrap my head around. But basically, most people blame Mt. Gox basically for not being able to deal with this feature of the protocol that everybody else knew about for years and had already solved. They've already created a workaround for this so-called bug. So, meanwhile, Mt. Gox now this week has gone completely offline and taken out their website, deleted all their tweets from Twitter, and just it's like the equivalent of like packing their bags and leaving the hotel without paying. They're like just gone. And there's been a leaked document, we don't know if it's real or not, that basically says that 750,000 Bitcoins have been stolen from Mt. Gox. We don't know if it was based on this transaction malleability bug or what, but that's 6% of all Bitcoins in existence, and they of course belong to many thousands of Bitcoin users, and this would be a really big problem. And then also, it would kind of underline the sense that Bitcoin is cash. If you hide it under your mattress, and somebody breaks into your bedroom, they're going to steal it. It's not like an FDIC insured bank account or something. If it's gone, it's gone. So that's part of what's caused this giant meltdown. Well, I wouldn't say giant. Something like 20% of Bitcoin's value in dollars was shaved off over the course of a couple of days and has slowly come back. So I don't know, David probably has a lot more to say about it than I do.
Well, David, also, whatever you want to say about it, but also, what are the lessons? I mean, there different people, different groups are taking different lessons. One being that, it will stabilize things eventually. Others that it's the end of Bitcoin. What do you think the lessons of this past couple weeks are? And also, what do you think happens? Go ahead.
I actually think, I think there's a little bit of silver lining, actually, I think, in the events of the last couple of weeks, because I think the Mt. Gox story is one story, but there's actually another story. There's a story actually in Miami, where law enforcement actually called up with a couple of guys who were supposedly laundering money using Bitcoins. And I think, why am I telling you that these are actually good things? Because the fact, first of all, Mt. Gox, by the way, even though, people broke into Mt. Gox, basically made away with some money and that kind of thing, that's not the first time it's happened. There are many changes this has happened. So from that point of view, this got a lot of precedent because this is the largest exchange. right? Especially after the Chinese exchanges got shut down a couple months ago, this has become, a very visible thing. But to me, it's interesting is that already the FBI is basically getting involved. I think, ironically, and then you now have, senators calling on the regulators to do more. I actually think this can actually accelerate the process of an attempt to try to regulate Bitcoin. Because I actually believe that the only way for Bitcoin to have a future is that it has to become part of the official payment system, so to speak. It has to allow itself to be regulated. So I think anything that's actually forcing that process is actually going to be a very good process. Because now, if I'm like, if I'm sitting in San Francisco, I'm running a major tech company, I see Bitcoin as something that is going to help me on these from Wall Street, I'm now basically willing to sit around the table and make some compromises perhaps with the regulators to actually cut a deal so that Bitcoin becomes a regulator. So I think from that point of view, every crisis, there's always an opportunity. I think this Mt. Gox thing from that point of view is interesting. Now the second incident, which happened I mentioned before, is a couple of guys got arrested down in Miami by law enforcement because they were laundering money using Bitcoin. Why do I say that's an excellent thing? Because it shows it can be done, that these bad guys can be caught. But even though Bitcoin's anonymous, okay, because when you make a payment to somebody else using your Bitcoin account, your account doesn't carry a name. It carries a number, and that number doesn't have a name attached to it. So in principle, nobody knows who's actually behind this transaction. However, what is so peculiar about Bitcoin is that these miners we talked about were like the historians of Bitcoin transactions, because every single transaction ever being made using a Bitcoin is basically recorded, documented, and stored somewhere in what's called basically a blockchain. So meaning actually, unlike cash, when you're money laundering and cash is almost untraceable, I don't tell you, not to mention gold, Bitcoin you can actually trace it. And the fact that actually these law enforcement guys were able to actually track down these guys because they were basically making very high value of transactions, which basically made them look suspicious, I actually think that this is going to actually silence critics of Bitcoins who say, oh well, this becomes totally Wild West, we can never basically enforce it. So I think that is actually also a thing.
That's really interesting. And how does that intersect with the idea of anonymity? In this realm, will there be some sacrifice of anonymity going forward, or how do you think that's going to play out?
I think it will have to be. I think to understand anonymity, this is where it sort of gets tricky. Now, by the way, I really enjoyed what you said. I think what he just said before, he would only hear in America. Because I've been obviously go around Asia, Europe, talking to regulators there. Believe me, like nobody talks like that. And then, in some sense, it's understandable why the Chinese and the Russians decided to crack down on Bitcoin, because Bitcoin really challenges the authoritarian regime there. Because there is nothing more subversive from that point of view than Bitcoin to try to undermine basically the ability of the Putin or the Chinese trying to control the economies by basically putting rules in place. So it's understandable why Bitcoin, as I said, as a home one day, is going to be here rather than anywhere else. I just think that right now, the future of Bitcoin, it has to. Right now, as we said, with the problem, I think in the U.S., I think from what I can tell, the Chinese are worried about Bitcoin becoming like a speculative bubble. By the way, until recently, 50% of all trading in Bitcoin was in China until they started crack down on it. And just like the Chinese speculate in walnuts, in corn, and basically and I think a couple of years ago they were speculating in garlic that went up like 100 times or something like that in the space of a few months. Bitcoin became a national sensation. It was just basically an object of speculation, just a question of when they were going to crack down on it. The Americans, on the other hand, it's interesting because until now, the United States had the toughest regulatory oversight over Bitcoin. This is why Bitcoin exchanges are being set up everywhere in the world, except in the United States. Because the United States, to actually operate as a Bitcoin exchange, you have to actually have state licenses, okay, to operate as a money transmitter. And I think, this is why, until now, the state regulators are still contemplating about what would be required to basically give out these licenses. And I think, I personally think that they're going to have to basically require that Bitcoin exchanges sacrifice anonymity. Because, I can understand the concerns about terrorism financing, about basically money laundering, which is, I think, the main preoccupation of the American regulators as opposed to the Chinese or the Russians. So I think from that point of view, right now, believe it or not, after Mt. Gox got shut down today, there are only two major exchanges left. You know what they are? One is in Thailand. Okay? The other one's in Slovenia. Of course, I mean, I don't want to be some procedures. Probably that's good news because the Thai government right now, they got so many problems. Bitcoin exchange is probably the last thing they got in their mind to basically crack down on it. But nevertheless, I think the point here is that, there are, I'm surprised the Bitcoin price haven't even corrected more this week because, I mean, you're running out of places where you can actually exchange dollars for Bitcoins and vice versa. So I think from that point of view, in the U.S., this is where I think people who really want to make Bitcoin into a big thing, they now have every incentive to want to sit down and talk to state regulators and try to see if they can cut a deal, whether it's New York or California.
Andy, do you agree with that?
Well, I just want to first address this idea that Bitcoin is traceable. It's a really complicated question, and it is traceable. That's kind of the whole way that Bitcoin works, is that there's this blockchain. Everybody gets to watch every transaction happen. It's like this unalterable ledger of every transaction that happens. So if I'm, if I want to give Karen a Bitcoin, then everybody in this room sees it happen and say, okay, Karen has Andy's Bitcoin, and that's basically the definition of her having it. So that's what the blockchain is. In that sense, Bitcoin is completely traceable, but it can only be traced back to essentially an address, a Bitcoin address. So if you buy your Bitcoins with a bank account on some regulated exchange, maybe that bank account or the exchange can be subpoenaed to connect your name to your address because they know your name. But if you mine your Bitcoin, there are ways to create Bitcoins essentially out of thin air with a lot of computer work, or if you buy it on the back alley or whatever, you just hand some guy some cash and he transfers you some Bitcoins, then there might not be any way to tie your Bitcoin address to your name. So in a sense, if you can use Bitcoin to buy illegal things, or you can launder Bitcoin in really dumb ways to get you caught. Or if you're careful, if you buy them with your real name and then you put them through a kind of laundry service, or you use all these new techniques that are actually developed now, like stealth addresses, something called coin join, it's sort of like the Bitcoins kind of like cross in the air as you're spending them, so that it becomes much more difficult to trace them back to a real name. Bitcoin can be used anonymously. So it's like the internet itself. Like the internet fundamentally has no anonymity, but if you use the right crypto tools and anonymity tools, it's actually possible to be really anonymous on the internet today using, probably Tor. That's another story. Anyway, so Bitcoin is traceable by default, but anonymous if you're smart enough, essentially. That's the kind of address the data.
Okay, one more question in covering the basics that I can think of, and that is, so we have Bitcoin, but then there are other virtual currencies that you read about, right? There's other ones coming on. So is this, where are we headed in this? Can it just go on and on to proliferation, or
Well,
what's
I would
the
say
point?
most of those currencies are people who feel like they missed out on Bitcoin and they want to just make their own and type it up and be the Satoshi Nakamoto of their own little world. They're not really viable, I don't think. One that is really interesting is called Zero Coin, and it basically is the people who wanted Bitcoin to be kind of anonymous by default first tried to sort of add this code onto Bitcoin, and nobody wanted to do it. And so they said, okay, we're going to take our ball and go home, and they made their own completely, by default, anonymous, untraceable cryptocurrency called Zero Coin. And that's going to be launching, I think, in something like September of this year. So that will be really interesting to watch. And the most interesting thing about that is that you can buy Bitcoins, and then on some exchange, potentially trade them for Zero Coins, and maybe use Zero Coins as like a whole new way of laundering Bitcoins, a giant currency whose only purpose really is to launder Bitcoins. I mean, or you could say laundering, or you could say, achieve financial privacy. I want to be unbiased.
Okay, Chip, where do you fall in on the regulation versus anonymity issue? Where do you think we're headed? What do you think is a good resolution? Do you think anonymity is going to be sacrificed? Should it be sacrificed? What do you think?
I already think you need to have a part 2 schedule. This is clearly a great conversation, and you're not going to have time to get through all the interesting issues that these guys are raising. I think regulation is inevitable. It's already happening. To David's point, that the states do require licenses to function as a money transmitter, and most states do. More importantly, or sort of more from a blanket perspective, so does the federal government. And the guidance from FinCEN last March clarified that if you were operating virtual currency as an exchanger, in effect, then you are a money transmitter. And then the rulings from last month provided more detail on specifically a decentralized convertible currency like Bitcoin, and specified Bitcoin in its ruling about if you're mining, but you're not transferring to third parties, and you're really just using it for your own purposes, and you're not a money transmitter, but you meant that third parties get involved, and you could be, and it's fact and circumstance driven, and there's plenty of room to color this in as we get smarter. But still say it's committing our time to break. As the government gets smarter about this, there's plenty of room to color it in, and I think they're taking the right approach. What I think is interesting to note is when you talk about anonymity, there's always this sort of immediate instinct that these are mutually exclusive interests across these different perspectives, and I don't think that's right. I think the history of regulation in the payment system has demonstrated that there is plenty of room for privacy and security. The trick is first understanding what are the legitimate need-to-know users in terms of who and what. And secondly, how do we ensure that the providers of the payment systems and the operators understand those obligations and comply with them in a level playing field? But I don't think there's anything inherently incompatible about deeply held and appropriately held, at least from the perspective of our country, privacy interests. And you talk about anonymity as sort of our enemy when you track and trace as a French investigator, it's our friend when we're trying to facilitate freedom of speech in places like Iran, where tweeting and those sorts of things were instrumental to getting people on the streets a few years back. And those sorts of events that happen for those reasons, as David has said, not a surprise that China, Russia, and some others are wary about this. So it's always more complicated, but I think taking a step back and looking at these interests from 10,000 feet, you have privacy interests that are hugely important. And it's sort of, as the lawyer will tell you, it's sort of a number of the Bill of Rights. It's sort of the unspoken 10th Amendment that we value very deeply for good reason. And at the same time, we have proven that the importance of financial information and financial action to our national security and to our criminal justice system is one in which we can't afford to ignore that. Nor can we afford to create a system in which some people play by the rules and others don't. So there is room for those interests to be integrated in a coherent, stable, fair, effective, and efficient system. And we're watching that unfold. That's the anonymity privacy issue. One other point that I would make, just based on the comments, and again, not to disagree at all, I think these guys know more about this stuff than I do. Practically, when you look at a virtual currency, one of the vulnerabilities that we have, the government looked at converting into really an opportunity, is the need functionally, practically, operationally to convert these virtual currencies into real currency at some point. And while that's not a prerequisite conceptually, if you've got a Bitcoin in such circulation that you can use it at a retail basis, and you don't necessarily need exchangers. But what we're saying is, unless you're investing in it, to use it, you've got to put at some point money, real money, to get Bitcoin. And as Andy said, you can do that as the Silk Road guys did. As basically, we'll take cash in off the street, we'll have in effect, an omnibus account in a bank, and then when you track back that omnibus account, it's the guys that are indicted, but these are guys who are operating in effect in illegal money transfer business. Who their customers were that would ultimately use Bitcoin, we don't know, which is why we need the regulation. But the point is, you do have that exchange from virtual to real at some point. And whether you go offshore or you stay onshore, the U.S. has proven that when you, as a network, as an illicit network, decide to make that exchange facility only available offshore in an effort to avoid jurisdiction, the U.S. will still reach you. And it reaches you through dollar clearing and through jurisdictional authorities like 311. We will shut it down. That's why we have liberties and reserve. The reserve is a dead instrument. Because it went offshore, because it were in Costa Rica, the U.S. can't touch us. So we said, okay, here's a 311 action. Anybody who touches liberty reserve loses their access to the U.S. You choose. You want liberty reserve, you want the U.S. market. Question answers itself. So it'll be interesting to see how this unfolds. I feel comfortable that the U.S. has the authority and the experience, and I think the perspective to get it right. But there's a lot of complicating factors. It won't be easy. It will likely be messy. And it'll be a hell of an interesting topic moving forward.
The other thing, I should just add, the other thing that happened this week, if we go back to that which is, for instance, that a senator called for banning Bitcoin outright for the first time.
Yesterday.
Yesterday. And I think Well, I guess today, Jenny Yellen responded, actually, listen, I'm not going to do that anyway, it's not my job. Nothing else. Probably, I think that most of the response has been, that's crazy, we're not going to pay, it's not right, but you know better than that.
Nobody knows what those people are thinking what they want, and I don't think anybody has any.
Okay, so David, let me ask you a question about, I get all this stuff about regulation for the point of law enforcement purposes and all of that. But I'm interested about regulation in terms of protecting the consumer, the investor, the person who puts their money into Bitcoin. And you mentioned FDIC before, the idea of putting money under your mattress, right? What I'm interested in is how far, is there a way to protect the consumer in this regulatory framework? And if so, what has to be done in that regard?
The whole point about Bitcoin, as I said before, it is supposed to do it. It's designed to be, self-policing. It's supposed to not have things like deposit transparency. So I think from that point, I don't think it can happen. But where the security bit comes in, this is where I just want to make sure that people understand this, right? Is okay, fine. We said you have this public key. You have a Bitcoin account, and the Bitcoin account has a public address, but you also have a private address, which is called a private key. For somebody to basically make a payment using your wallets, meaning your money, they have to somehow gain access to your private key. Now, what's happened, in instances where exchanges were broken through, and Bitcoins were basically stolen, was that a lot of these exchanges, because they're storing a lot of basically these private keys, they store them on computers. So if you can actually penetrate a network and get at these basically private keys, you can basically, essentially rob all the Bitcoins, whatever. But if you basically, however, as an individual, if you write down that piece of paper on a piece of paper and basically lock it up in somewhere, there's no way. So from that point, it's actually very safe. It's actually not that easy to actually break it. Okay, and then you know what? It's not like your ATM card. Your ATM card could be stolen, and somebody could actually get to your number and basically crack in. Actually, with credit card theft all the time. But Bitcoin, I think, I don't have a Bitcoin account. My understanding is your private key is 20 letters and basically numbers. It's a very, very long chain. It's actually a very secure technology. The only place where it becomes insecure is at these exchanges. And this is what we're talking about because you only win. There are only two ways. Let's say you tomorrow, you get really excited about Bitcoin this evening, you want to go buy yourself something. And there are only two ways you can acquire Bitcoin, basically. In large amounts, of course. Either you become a miner, meaning you buy a lot of computers and you become a historian for Bitcoin transaction, and you earn Bitcoins, for a living. The only other way is by going to a Bitcoin exchange, converting your dollars into basically Bitcoin. And then it's ironic because all the security issues that come up is in that axis between Bitcoin and the traditional payment system that where accidents happen. But I have to believe, and again, I'm not a tech guy, but it seems to me conceptually this is not a problem that's insurmountable because there's nothing about Bitcoin in terms of the inherent design that makes it less secure than paper money, or certainly it's definitely more secure than cash, or traveling along gold, or basically even your credit cards that could be basically stolen and so on and so forth.
You guys agree with that?
Yeah, I think that the elaborate on what David was saying, so basically every time you use your credit card, you hand it to someone and you show them, David was pointing out that Bitcoins, to steal a Bitcoin you have to have a private key. But when you want to receive a Bitcoin or spend Bitcoin, you just show your public key. And that you can't use to steal a Bitcoin. That's only for spending, it's not, it's only for receiving, it's not for spending. So you can show everybody your public key and they can give you money that way. But they have to have your private key to steal your Bitcoin. If you want to if you want to spend money with your credit card, you have to basically show your private key to the waiter or Amazon or whoever. And that's an incredibly dumb idea. It's so ridiculous. In fact, if you look at the terms of service, one of my colleagues at Forbes pointing out, of her Chase card, it says, do not reveal your credit card number to anyone. Okay. And with Bitcoin, that's actually possible. You can keep the private key secret and still use it. It's it has this sort of public face as well as the private part you can't show. So Bitcoin is fundamentally smarter than credit cards in that way. And I think that much of the promise of Bitcoin, or the people see in Bitcoin, is that there will be less fraud once it becomes fully integrated into the economy, and then we can shave off that 2% of the cost of using a credit card that really goes to covering all the fraud costs that are so rampant with Target getting hacked tens of millions. Our private keys, essentially.
It's time for your questions. Do you have any questions? Let's start with Scott.
So I'm going to do this without a microphone if somebody can't hear me.
You're all going to do it without a microphone, so
Okay.
everybody knows.
So this is one of the things that is sort of challenged me about this process. We've got these miners, these historians, as you just discussed. Over time, however, the code will produce fewer and fewer Bitcoins, right, on an annual basis. And presumably they're going to get harder and harder to mine. Now, does that create a collective action problem at some point down the line that there's less incentive for these people to be out there mining? And once that happens, it becomes easier to potentially, right, if we're not keeping as good a real-time log, it in theory potentially, and computing power increases over that time, it becomes easier to duplicate it. So by limiting it, right, if in fact the value continues to go up over time and the value, right, out, they're worth $20,000 and the value now outstrips them, people will continue to mine. But at some point, those lines in theory are going to cross, and then what happens?
I hate to be the technical guy on this panel. I'm not I'm a reporter. But I think the answer is that there's going to be a transition over time. The miners who today are being incentivized by producing their own coins. They get paid in Bitcoins essentially for being the people, the guardians of the blockchain. Eventually, they're going to charge transaction fees instead. So every time a transaction happens, you put a little bit of Bitcoin on the transaction that gets paid to the people who used to be miners. You can still call them miners, I guess, to verify that transaction. So they get paid for their work directly instead of being paid sort of like as a side effect, a brilliant side effect of the way Bitcoin is loaded. I guess the question is, will those transaction fees rise to the point where it's no longer efficient to use Bitcoin? And that's a really tough question. But it seems like they could be pretty significant and still be a lot less than what you pay for credit cards, and still be a really valuable new way to spend money.
I'm Susan Witt. I'm with the Schumacher Center for New Economics, and we're behind the issuing of Berkshires.
Okay, we can do this afterwards.
Well,
I'm sorry, if it's a question, great.
It's a question.
Okay.
So Berkshires are exchanged with banks, 13 local banks, and we're now looking at issuing loans for in Berkshires. But the new regulations for virtual currencies are also trapping very simple local currencies like Berkshires. And can you talk about that and the impact?
Thank you. That's a good question. David, do you want to address that?
I
think that the way I
understand. With the Berkshire.
No, but I think the question she's getting at is, what does virtual currency mean for what we all understand as regular currency? And is there any threat to it in terms of what are the rest of the financial system that we're used to?
Berkshires is like a money co-op where local merchants agree to accept,
Right.
and they give them, they're discounted, and it's localized in the Berkshires in Massachusetts.
So I don't want to cut you off, but I'm going to go Bill a little bit here because it would be irresponsible to at least try to address this. From a Treasury perspective, again, not speaking for Treasury Department, historically, different payment instruments have been looked at through a lens of as we've had these new payment technologies emerge. Are we talking about, to your point, a closed loop where we have a currency like a Metro card that is just used by a limited group of users, like a Metro station? or a Starbucks card, or a Target card. It's not freely convertible. It is a currency for a closed loop of vendors or merchants or users. That presents a set of risks that's very different than open loop, which is to say payment mechanisms that ride the rails of the ATM networks or the credit card networks and that are much more convertible. And you've seen the regulations in Treasury. They don't distinguish between, say, for example, this kind of card or that kind of card, whether Berkshire or something else, but they do distinguish between closed loop and open loop. So you have to do an analysis of whether it's Berkshire's or something else. Say, is this a closed loop card? And if so, then a certain kind of regulation required applies. And if it's an open loop card, then a different type would apply. But the idea there is to manage the risk with a set of controls that is commensurate with the risk and level the playing field for all providers in the space. That's the idea.
Well, what I can tell, I mean, I think there's one other definition. I mean, you're saying, neither Berkshire nor, Bitcoin is a legal tender, right? I mean, the difference between a currency and legal tender is that legal tender means, like, you want to pay taxes, to the IRS in US dollar, they're obliged to take it. If you want to basically pay with Bitcoin, they're not obliged to take it. That's it. So I think from that point of view, therefore, the value of Berkshire or Bitcoin depends very much on the willingness of other people to accept it as a form of payment. So I think that is the big difference between, I think, dollars and everything else.
Curious about to what extent volatility is an impediment to ordinary usage in the sense that someone doesn't want to sell something that's worth $500 and get one Bitcoin and find out tomorrow that it's only $400. And also to the extent of how these crises, to the extent that Bitcoin can withstand these crises and still have a value, lends it more credibility in the sense that we've had made the most predominant Bitcoin exchange essentially go under, and Bitcoin is still at 500, somewhere between $400 and $500 a Bitcoin. So does that lend it some stability in the mind of the consumer, in your experience?
I think that's a very important part. It's a very complex topic that we can sit here and spend the rest of the evening just talking about that. But let me just say this. There's no question right now, and I think I'm not the only person who's saying this, many people, I think there's a very strong consensus in the market that the biggest problem that for Bitcoin right now is volatility, right? Because the problem is, for like Amazon to accept Bitcoin, they don't know how to basically manage the volatility of Bitcoin pricing. You pay them in Bitcoin and it goes down 20-30% within 5 minutes. They have no way of hedging it, or so to speak, right? That's the problem. Because the idea was, because Eddie was saying before, right now, American Express is going to charge Amazon 2% for accepting a payment from you, but Bitcoin is 0. But if that currency, but Bitcoin will basically fall 3% the next 30 seconds, then it's actually cheaper for them to use American Express than basically use Bitcoin, obviously. So therefore, volatility needs to go down in order for Bitcoin to continue to gain acceptance. But for volatility to go down, ironically, you need more people using it. Okay? You need liquidity to improve. You need more and more people to want to use it, to transact, and that kind of thing. So from that point of view, I wouldn't want to judge the future of Bitcoin tomorrow based on its volatility today. Because volatility today is a function of its infancy. And so from that point of view, I think this is why I think, if an aspire, that's why for me, the only thing of any interest right now about Bitcoin is whether a major exchange can successfully acquire a US license. And the reason is because right now you've got all these little exchanges in Thailand and Slovenia and middle of nowhere, and then so liquidity is getting totally scattered. If you have a major few exchanges, okay, like NASDAQ or like New York Stock Exchange, all of a sudden all of this liquidity gets concentrated, you will see immediately a decline in volatility. And that decline in volatility will then basically encourage more people using it, which would then, so become basically self-fulfilling, becomes a positive thing. So I think that's why I think the volatility is an important thing, but it's not a problem for Bitcoin's growth.
Volatility is going down, right? It is like this most recent Docs crisis, because there have been tons of them. I think if you look at as a percentage of Bitcoin's value, it was much smaller prices, and there are more and more actual e-commerce sites accepting Bitcoin that overstock and direct, and it will be a lot more.
Yes. So.
Stand up so we can hear.
So as I understand it, Bitcoins are, I guess, minted through this mining process, correct? And Am I correct in that?
Yeah, there's lines.
Okay, sorry, so,
Sure.
and that's decentralized, so like anyone could do it, they use their Bitcoin client program to do that? Do I also understand that correctly?
Basically, yeah.
Okay, so the question I'm getting at is how easy would it to be for someone, I guess, to counterfeit Bitcoins, maybe by altering their client process, their client program to like speed up the Bitcoin production process? Is that something that's been considered?
It's impossible, but I don't know exactly why. It's, I think
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
The only thing I would say is, I mean, I think right now, mathematically, and again, I don't know why, but I know the fact, which is that mathematically, in order for someone to crack the system, they need to have basically, you have to control more than half the computing power in the system. Okay, to be able to actually counterfeit and trying to basically do stuff to it.
Okay.
And so this is why Bitcoin has a very decentralized system, where like miners are competing with each other, and also think about it, the miners also have an incentive to police each other because they're in this business mining Bitcoin. They want to see Bitcoin prices go up, so they have an incentive to spy on each other, make sure that everybody basically falls in line. And this is why I think again, for someone with that much computing power, enough to basically take over the entire system, that is very unlikely, especially given now already you've got thousands of people who are doing this. Conclusions can be very difficult.
Stand up.
Sorry, Dave Farber, I'm a student here at Fordham. There have been a lot of talk about individuals creating exchange-traded funds for Bitcoin and other ventures that are coming up. Do you see that lending credence to Bitcoin, or are those opportunities just doomed to failure because of the fact that this is a pseudo-anonymous currency?
Bank analyst. Listen, by the way, I just want to say this. I work at Bank of America Merrill Lynch. I don't represent the bank. I represent the bank's research force. So from that point of view, and because there's a lot of reports that we want to sort of avoid, because I think most Wall Street banks are right now taking a wait and see attitude in terms of seeing where the regulations are going to fall before they want to jump into this thing. I think right now, again, I think this ETF business is exactly like an exchange, because the idea is that you buy and you sell, you're basically converting dollars into Bitcoin. I think the ETF is going to have exactly the same problem. Right now, they're talking about an ETF that's linked to Bitcoin price rather than actually buying and selling Bitcoin. And so far, my understanding, it hasn't really been going anywhere. In fact, the issuer of that ETF second market, they just announced this week that they want to actually start applying for a license for an exchange. So I think that's where we are.
I should preface this by saying I'm a monetary moron. I've got decimated when the gold standard was.
You don't have to repeat that part, sir.
Okay. But I'm wondering, as you describe it, the Bitcoins are here and the banks and the credit cards are over here. Where will they meet? Where's the compromise? Where essentially can you make any kind of prediction?
I think in the end, I think innovation ultimately should basically drive more competition, so that everybody benefits in the end. I mean, right now, if you're a Mexican construction worker, illegal one, especially sitting in California, you're trying to basically send some money home, and your basically parents, in Mexico don't have a bank account. Guess what? You would go through Western Union, they're going to basically charge you 10%. Okay, Bitcoin's going to charge you 0 or virtually 0. So from that point of view, if Bitcoin does become, regulated, you have to believe it's going to put a lot of pressure on the traditional providers of payment services to basically innovate themselves so they can bring down prices. So ultimately, I think this is why I think the regulators in the US do have an incentive to basically make this work, because they see this as a catalyst for change. Because why should you pay 2 or 3%? Basically making payments, using your credit card. Man, that's a ridiculous notion, actually. No, I work for a bank. No, I shouldn't say that.
Way in the back there, yeah.
Hi, everyone. Okay, so I just have an issue with the traceable aspect of it, and perhaps you can clarify this. So if these miners eventually will become gatekeepers, so to speak, where they verify transactions, I'm sorry?
They already do verify it.
Okay, so in that aspect, as far as it being, I guess anonymous, it's really not. And if we think about fraud, most of the time, the people who commit these frauds are actually people who have access. So, in this context, if our private number, which you talked about, if they have access to that as well, then isn't it liable that they can use our coins?
The miners don't get access to your private key.
Okay.
So you make your own code for your private key?
Well, it's,
Somebody give it to you, or just? I mean,
How does that work, and where's it
it's like the
stored?
magic of what they call public key cryptography, that that you can basically generate, or you can use a public key to generate a private, or sorry, this is public. But you can essentially use a private key to generate a version of the private key that basically allows people to send you money, but they never see the value itself. So there's no real easy way to explain this in terms of seconds. But I'm sorry, what was the question again?
I think the question is, how come it sounds traceable to him because you
Right.
have a number assigned to you, so you could.
I'm sorry, I mean, the miners, I mean, if you get into technicalities, the miners do have some information about where the transactions are originating. But what they don't have, they don't know what address is what name. I mean, all they know is that 63827 is sending money to 2486 whatever. That's it. Maybe your bank or whoever you use to buy the bitcoins in the first place, they actually know your name, so maybe they could be subpoenaed to give it up. It's true that like the miners might be able to trace the actual internet traffic rather than the Bitcoin addresses. They might know your IP address. This is like a really technical thing. But more and more Bitcoin transactions are being put through Tor, this internet anonymity software, so that it's like you're kind of throwing your voice to the other side of the internet and nobody knows where the transaction originated. So, so the answer to the question, the miners can't unmask people
Well, it's not
easily
just-
at all, and probably won't be able to at all very soon.
I'm sorry, but it's not about knowing who the addresses. I'm sorry, it's not about knowing the I guess identity of the people.
Right.
It's the transaction being utilized without your actual authority. So if it's not authorized and these miners have access to it, they can use it. They can spend it.
So they don't,
They don't have access to
their
it.
job is not to facilitate the payment itself. Like, Citibank basically making payment to basically JP Morgan. Their job is to basically document that transaction having taken place. So they never actually touch the money, so to speak.
Basically what the miners do is like, they say like, oh, Andy wanted to send a Bitcoin to Karen. Everybody write that down. You got that? You got that? You got that? Like thousands of people saying, I got it. Andy sent a Bitcoin to Karen. That's all that they do. That doesn't mean that they have money. That's in fact like the only definition of Karen having a Bitcoin. There is no, actual physical thing. It's just that we've all agreed. Like thousands of miners have agreed that Karen has a Bitcoin. And if somebody else types up and says, no, I have the Bitcoin, and they're like, what are you talking about? Karen has the Bitcoin. We all agree Karen has the Bitcoin. That's all the blockchain is. That's how miners are guardians of the blockchain in that sense.
It's awesome.
You mentioned examples
Speak
of money laundering and people being prosecuted for that. Are you aware of any examples of terrorist financing using bitcoins or of terrorists using bitcoins?
I haven't seen anything. I don't know if others have. And I don't know if the government authorities that are tracking, tracing, and financing terrorist organizations would have anything. What I think everybody recognizes is that where you have a vulnerability that is apparent through anonymity, that it will attract those actors that have an interest in being anonymous. That's clear. And I think the Silk Road episode is a good example of that. That creates a real challenge if there is a foot race to anonymity by illicit actors for authorities that are charged with tracking and tracing those. At the same time, it creates a little bit of a targeting zone, right? So if we have guys that aren't looking at Bitcoin, they should be, because there's probably a lot of interesting activity on those that are transacting Bitcoin. So there are obviously agencies in the government whose job it is to track and trace that stuff. So it does create a little bit of a targeting pool. But what you can do with that is in large respects dictated by the information associated with the transaction, which, as we've heard, is really pseudonymous, right? And you can have transactional trails. And I was going to say in response to the last question, one of the underlying concepts or assumptions in the philosophy of financial information being so important in tying illicit networks together is that money trails don't lie, right? That's what you keep hearing that. And all this is a manifestation of that. It's, look, we're making a public record that so-and-so paid such and such. And that's always true. To execute the transaction, you need to do that, right? But that's not enough. Because if we did that, then everyone would have a number bank account. And that's sort of how I equate the Bitcoin phenomenon, is that you have a transactional record that isn't tied to a particular party. And we used to live in a world like that. We decided a long time ago that that was not acceptable. So now you don't go into a bank and say, hi, I'm number 7. You go to the bank and you produce ID, you say how much it costs, et cetera, and then the account and the information associated with the account is transacted with wires and relationships between you and your other parties. All pursuant to regulation, all designed to give us transparency in the system so that people aren't exploiting the financial system to do various things. So it's not that the anonymity associated with the names is okay because we have transactional visibility. That's not okay. That's the whole reason why we got rid of numbered accounts, right? And that's a really important distinction.
I'm looking at it from the asset freezing perspective, and I wonder if you can see a world where you can freeze Bitcoins that belong to a listed person.
Yeah, once you're able to assign.
Let me just repeat the question. Is there a foreseeable future soon, I assume, where you can freeze Bitcoins like we now freeze money? It's done.
There seize Bitcoins.
Silk Road.
Yeah.
It's Silk Road.
The FBI controls 1.5% of all Bitcoins now because they seize by hacking.
But I want to have a follow-on question to this, which is you're talking about illicit, individuals and illicit, in this case, terrorist groups or whatever, criminal enterprise. But what about a state actor? What about if the United States government is using financial sanctions against an unnamed country, and the unnamed country finds a way to get around those sanctions through the Bitcoin network? Then what?
It's no different than sanctions evasion writ large, right? So if you were to start with the premise that what is the sanctions requirement? Sanctions requirement, and this is not necessarily popularly understood, it's not to freeze financial instruments or money. It's to freeze all assets owned by the party that is designated. That's how our sanctions program works. So if you have a horse farm, or this happened, right? I can't remember which cartel we did all the quarter horses with. But we seized, it was the Zetas. The Zeta cartel owned a whole bunch of horse breeding farms. We seized the farms. The United States government seized the farms. And that's an interesting issue. Like, how do you manage that asset? We need to get a license to feed the horses so they don't die. Can we buy fertilizer or whatever? Feed the fertilizer, they make fertilizer. Point being that sanctions is a really interesting topic when you think about what the law actually does require in instances where you get outside of sort of the conventional financial assets. And Bitcoin will present challenges on that, no doubt. But as a matter of law, it's clear, yes, and as a matter of practice, it's happened. And that's probably an interesting study in its own right. Beyond that, whoever we designate, whoever the government designates, is going to take measures to evade those sanctions. And let's be clear, in the case of Iran, it was very clear that Iran started moving value in gold. And that is a publicly acknowledged concern that led to targeting designations and advisories associated with exchange houses in the UAE and in Turkey, very much associated with substituting gold as a value transfer mechanism for currency. They were shot the dollar, they were shot the euro, they couldn't settle, and so they started moving gold. And then you saw the U.S. Treasury respond with designations and advisories and enhanced due diligence requirements on exchange houses that were in effect taking advantage of that arbitrage by marketing themselves, which is obviously a problem. So there's always going to be that cops and robbers game in sanctions evasion. In this instance, cyber Bitcoin is another avenue, and because of the vulnerabilities I was explaining earlier that we're all familiar with, it is something that I think, and I hope our guys the U.S. government should be looking at.
We're going to take 2 questions in a row because there's a lot more coming, you, and first, don't answer until later.
Thanks, everyone. I think it's a good topic. I think from a regulatory standpoint, might be a long-winded question, but anything from like the
Not too
OCC,
long.
yeah, like the OCC or from an OPEC perspective, well, for example, like Iran and terrorism, like banking is my science is strict liability. So let's say you're not even aware of it, when you get caught, then as a bank, you're held liable. But we know that banks have been hit on the regulatory side because they just have weaknesses in like know your customer and all types of controls. But I haven't heard anything so far coming from the OCC, for example, the Office of the Currency Controller, and things like that about it. I don't know if Disney Plus about things like that. Yeah, sure. Thanks.
What are the IRS tax implications with Bitcoin?
Thanks, Karen. Yeah. So the tax and OCC guidance. I haven't seen anything from the federal banking agencies as well, but in the space of combating illicit finance, the regulations that are perpetrated to that mission, those are owned in effect. They're administered and enforced by FinCEN as a component of the Treasury Department, a different component, a different bureau than the OCC, and for sanctions by OFAC. And FinCEN has spoken, I think, significantly on this issue with, again, guidance that they've issued last year, I think it was March 2013, about virtual currencies, as they're calling it, to include convertible decentralized currency like Bitcoins. They have issued rulings applying that to specific cases, including a Bitcoin case last month. They have taken enforcement actions against those providers of virtual currencies that do not comply with those requirements in the form of a 311 action against Liberty Reserve last year. So there are actions that have been taken that I think are starting to define what this field looks like on the BSA side. On the sanction side by OFAC, you haven't seen anything in the form of targeting or authority to target on the basis of being a virtual currency issued by the Treasury Department. And I don't think you're going to, because there's nothing inherently wrong about virtual currencies. It's a technology that can be exploited like the internet or the dollar for good and for bad. So the sanctions regimes that you've seen come out of Treasury have been very much about conduct and actors of concern associated with that conduct, whether they're states or non-states. And in this realm, you could see Bitcoin being, from that perspective, a vulnerability where, again, it might create a targeting ground for, this is where the bad guys go. We're not designating Bitcoin, we're designating the Silk Road, which is using this virtual currency to transact on behalf of all bad actors. We're designating Liberty Reserve, which is coming from its own currency to do the same thing. You'll see those sorts of actions. You're not going to see a takedown of a currency or a virtual currency from those authorities. I think any sort of a prohibition on that would come from a legislative move. And it was interesting to see that there is some voicing that. And it's inevitable, right? I mean, someone's going to take that bait. But is it ultimately going to be persuasive? I don't think so. And then you're going to see on the tax side, ultimately, I think guidance as to how to deal with this. And you're seeing, I think it's the Netherlands, there has been some overseas tax authorities that have started to weigh in on this. And it may be the Netherlands, don't quote me on that. But I do know for sure that there have been other finance ministries that have started to look at the tax implications of Bitcoin. As long as this is something that is foreseeable, my own view is whether Bitcoin or something else, virtual currencies are going to have a place in the market. Then these sorts of implications are going to have to be addressed.
Can I ask
Yes, of course.
question?
Please.
I didn't hear one question. Jim, tell me, so you believe that there is enough common ground between the Bitcoin world and the regulators, so that there will be regulations and there will be license exchanges and so on and so forth. But do you think that, well, I mean, what's the sort of process, mentioned the timeline? Do you believe, for example, there will be legislations required? Because like Europe, for example, right now, they could either try to modify existing regulations, okay, or they have to basically pass new legislation. Which route do you think they'll go? And also, like right now, if you want to basically open an exchange in New York, you can only, basically do business with New York residents. If you want to basically do business with everybody else, you got to basically get licensed everywhere else. To what extent do you think there will be coordination across the 48 states that do require licenses, or that everybody's going to be, for themselves?
Yeah, those are great questions, and I think the only way you can start to answer that is to begin to think through what is it exactly that we're regulating. We're back to Karen's opening question, which is a great place to be. What is Bitcoin? To the extent that the authorities see Bitcoin as a money transmission mechanism, which they clearly do, right? Then you've seen the regulation in that space, and that's the FinCEN domain. So you've seen FinCEN come in and say, you're a money transmitter if you do A, B, and C, or A, B, or C in the virtual currency space defined as this. They've done that. I think when you start to look at it as, for example, an investment, a commodity investment, I suppose, that's a separate set of concerns, right? Where you're going to have different jurisdictional authority and different types of risks and different types of interests. So all of a sudden now it becomes a speculative issue, and you say, what about the depositors of this investment? Well, okay, is it a currency? Is it a commodity? If it's a commodity, is it a CFTC issue? If it's a security, it's an SEC issue. Either way, if they decide that they're going to go down that road, then if you want to market this to the public, you've got registration, and then you're off and running. So the good news is you have rails, regulatory oversight and jurisdiction already in place. The decision over how to, not whether, because we're already doing it, how to regulate a virtual currency will hinge in many respects on how is it that the authorities see that currency functionally. And the only thing that's clear at this point is that it is clearly a money transmission mechanism. Beyond that, you've got a really interesting live debate, right? It's an investment vehicle, it's a commodity. No, it's a security. No, it's not. It's a currency. Well, it can't be currency. It's not fiat backed. What the hell does that mean? And that's what we're witnessing. And that's what's so interesting about it. But I do think the regulation ultimately can only happen to the extent that there is comfort in understanding what it is that we're regulating. And the only comfort that we've seen today is categorizing this technology as a money transmission vehicle with the acknowledgement. And certainly you go to the Bitcoin sort of true believers, and they'll tell you that's nothing. Like, we want to be, the de facto currency. Okay, well, that's a different question. But that's far from settled, and you're going to have a lot of different opinions on that. And you won't see regulation, I think, until you have more clarity over what those other functions might be.
So what would be your prediction in terms of the timeline? I mean, when do you think it's a 2014 story? Do you think 2015, 2016?
So much of that depends on what happens with Bitcoin as a popular or not vehicle. And to the extent that this becomes widespread, it sort of forces the issue. To the extent that you have crises like the Mt. Gox and depositors left holding the bag and it becomes a political issue, then you've got a forced event. But it is so volatile at the moment that, a Mt. Gox, I was talking to folks this morning saying, yeah, I think I'm on a panel about the Bitcoin thing. What exactly happened with Mt. Gox? When you're dealing with a technology that's literally this sort of day in, day out, well, what's going to happen this week with Bitcoin? I don't know that you can have a crystal ball that's worth projecting. My own view is things to watch: implementation of what are already regulatory requirements. So if FinCEN says you're a money transmitter if you do this, well, how are we going to implement that? That's a requirement on the books now. How are they going to implement it? Watch that. 2, outside of money transmission, where is the next functionality going to start to coalesce some public opinion and momentum behind? Is it going to be as an investment speculation issue? Is it going to be as a currency issue? There are real challenges to both. On the currency side, you've got the fundamental sort of conventional wisdom that ties it to jurisdictional which this by definition will never have. Then you've got the downstream question of, well, let's say we get over that as a public policy debate and say it can still be a currency. What is the responsibility of a currency? There is none as far as I know. There's responsibility on the jurisdiction that backs the currency. You remove that, who's accountable? Nobody's answered that one yet. But that's a functionality question. Third thing to watch, internationally, it's a common payment system. It's a global financial system. So you can't do this alone, as much as the U.S., I think, is hugely influential in its enforcement actions and its public debates. when you have a Russian China take steps to criminalize it, it has real impacts on what happens. And in my view, you're going to see now a much more visible public debate in 2014 about we can't criminalize for all the reasons that everyone's talking about. We shouldn't criminalize, but we do have to manage, we have to understand the risk in order to manage, and we have to functionally categorize what we're prepared to accept this as before we can do anything. And I would bet in 2014 you're going to see a coalescence around this is a money transmission mechanism. We have international standards and norms for governing that. Jurisdictions should be applying those. And jurisdictions that have criminalized it should be rethinking this. Remember, halalas were criminalized after 9/11 in a lot of places. And then people woke up and said, hey, this is just Western Union without the Western Union sign. We regulate this. We don't criminalize it. Money transmission isn't evil. It's just a fact of life. So if people want to transmit being halal, these aren't magic people flying around magic carpets with magic money. It's just payment. It's just payments. So it's regulated that way. But it took a while for people to realize that, right? I mean, there's some people who think halalas are magical. No, they're Western Union guys without Western Union. It'll be a while for this space to mature, but I'm hopeful with that learning curve, people will say, as it turns out, Bitcoin isn't magic and wizardry. At least as a starting point, it's money transmission. And as that happens, you'll see the international rails that start to fold into norms we've already established.
It's funny that you brought up the halal, because I've been so careful not to. Really good.
Sorry.
Because I mean, I think that is one of the things that needs to be talked about, but another time. So I'm assuming that all of you assume that Bitcoin has a future. In other words, that the people who are saying, oh, this recent week said it's the end of Bitcoin, that none of you would agree with that.
I certainly think that virtual currencies are here to stay.
Okay.
Bitcoin is an interesting question. I think there are definitely the inside.
Andy, you agree with that?
Definitely. Yeah.
David, you agree with that?
I think it's going to come down to Washington. I mean, if they take too much time, then I think Bitcoin is going to lose a lot of its momentum. So I think that's what's going to happen.
It's very interesting. So what are the takeaways from tonight? Yes, go
Before we
ahead.
go on, that's David. You were the first person to ever put a price, an analyst price on the target Bitcoin. Do you think that it's undervalued then, or overvalued now?
No, I mean, so at the time, I think the day I put out my report, Bitcoin was trading at about $1,300.
Yeah.
And then, I was saying in fact, $1,300 is actually the maximum fair value. So the upper limit for the fair value, and the way I came to my numbers is the following. I made the following assumptions. I said, well, at $1,300, what is the market pricing into the future of Bitcoin? Right? Because Bitcoin have two functions, both as a store of value as well as basically a payment. I said, well, let's assume that 10% of all online transactions would in the future be all denominated in Bitcoins. Let's assume that basically Bitcoin becomes a dominant place of money transfer like Western Union. And let's assume that Bitcoin ultimately acquires the status of gold, of silver, not quite gold, okay? How much will be, if all that becomes possible, and that's a very ambitious assumption. If all that became true, how much should basically Bitcoin be valued? I said 1,300.
So actually, everyone saw your report and they thought, wow, Bank of America is putting this stamp on Bitcoin and saying it's fairly valued. And you're actually saying this is the most it could ever be in the perfect world. And,
Look, in fact, obviously, the problem with journalists is that, they always say, I'm sorry. Actually, they said very specific in the report, I said, well, this suggests that actually the recent run-up in Bitcoin price has got a little bit of it. So I think that's what it is. But I think that was, but that definitely putting a number out there that got a lot of people interested.
And the beauty of journalists is that they're here to explain all of this to the rest of the world, so we have to be very grateful to them. Okay, so I've learned some things tonight. Bitcoin's better than cash, better than a credit card, and it's the one place anonymity is left in America, because apparently through the NSA we don't have privacy and anonymity elsewhere. So that would be my takeaway from tonight. So the reason we did tonight was to figure out if we should do more events on Bitcoin. So I think probably the answer is we're just beginning. So I think we'll probably see all of you again. Thank you so much. So wonderful.